Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today I wanted to ask the question, is the game too fast and do we need more defensive options? So this is something that happens quite a lot in card games, especially digital card games, where the developers don't really want the game to feel sluggish, they don't want it to feel slow, so they tend to remove a lot of the cards that do slow the format down. We have seen this in other games such as Cardfight Vanguard, and we've also seen this in Hearthstone, where in one game they basically give you a lot more offensive options and give you a lot fewer defensive options so that progress is always happening throughout the course of the game. And in Hearthstone's case, they took out the ability to interact with your opponent during their turn and gave you secrets instead that you could use, and they would trigger sort of like automatic trap cards rather than having the option to constantly nag you to be like, do you want to react? Do you want to react? As we've seen in a lot of prior Yu-Gi-Oh games in the past. The question I'm asking today is the Rush Duel Links game too fast? And if the game is too fast, do we need more defensive options to slow the game down just a little bit so that we're not just getting OTK'd left and right? So first things first, let's talk about some of the decks that have really sped up and can really kill their opponent very quickly. So what better place to start than Cyber Dragons? So Cyber Twin Dragon is a card that a lot of people weren't sure we were going to get this early, because 2800 attack that can attack twice is pretty good. As we soon learned though, a lot of the other decks also have similar power level cards, allowing Cyber Twin Dragon to basically keep up with those other decks. But 2800 attack that can attack twice can be very, very devastating. If your opponent, for example, can't get 3 bodies on the board, we could clear their 2 other bodies with other monsters, and then Cyber Twin can get in for a whopping 5600 damage, which would leave your opponent at only 400 life points, so can be rather devastating. But Cyber Twin isn't the only good card that Cyber Dragon got. They also have access to Cyber End Dragon. Now, Cyber End Dragon is sometimes a bit of a vulnerability. It does use up a lot of resources and doesn't have any protection. So when we think about committing 4 cards into this boss that can just get blown up out of nowhere, it doesn't seem as attractive, but still having a 4000 attack monster that can inflict piercing damage can quite often put a 2-turn clock on the game. And if your opponent doesn't have a good out to this just on hand, or if they don't draw it for turn, well, the game's over and we just get to win off of Cyber End. And finally, Cyber Dragons are allowed to play Ancient Gear Golem, which is another really good option. Just having a large statted piercing monster is really, really good, and a lot of decks can really struggle to out Ancient Gear Golem. 3000 attack and 3000 defense means that outing this card isn't as simple as just changing it to a defense and attacking over it. We do have to effectively boost over it or completely remove the Ancient Gear Golem, which can be tricky depending on the deck you're playing. But we can't talk about OTKing our opponent without talking about Hyper Strike Dragon Dragia Star F. Now this card doesn't so much OTK your opponent so much as apply so much pressure and put a 2-turn clock on the game that your opponent can't necessarily do anything about it. Hyper Strike Dragon doesn't tend to actually kill your opponent in one go, but it will do it slowly over the course of 2 turns and completely delete them out of the game. Being able to double attack Pierce is really, really strong because there's no way to defend against this. And it can also boost its attack up to 3900, which means it can clear over just about anything and get a ton of damage in as well. Now, there are a few things this won't be able to clear over, but the deck will be playing things like Talismanic Seal Array, we'll be playing things like Fortitude Dragon to help it get that little extra boost that it needs to clear just about anything. So Hyper Strike Dragon Dragia Star F is just a really, really strong card that can really speed up the pace of the game. And the next deck we're going to talk about is Light Galaxy. So Galactica Oblivion seems a bit unassuming. It doesn't have an effect, it's 2500 attack, but if we use our skill, we can send this card to the graveyard and then search out Secret Order, immediately activate Secret Order, and then bam, we immediately have a 2500 attack, effectively has been normal summoned. Not to mention it will have trap protection and boosted by 700 for the turn, so it's like we just normal summon from our hand a 3200 attack monster. And you're thinking, well, if your opponent's got 3 defense position monsters, that doesn't really matter. Well, if we have Meteor Charge in our hand, or because the skill can also search Meteor Charge, we could either open up a Secret Order or a Meteor Charge, then just search the other one with the skill. We can then use Meteor Charge to give our 3200 attack monster Piercing. And we can also change one of our opponent's monsters that's face down defense to face up attack, summon out another monster and attack over that for even more damage, which does just put a really, really fast clock on the game. Light Galaxy is a deck that tends to try and win the game within 2 or 3 turns, and it's able to do so by using Secret Order to get out these really high-statted monsters very, very efficiently, very, very quickly, and then use Meteor Charge to try and close out the game through defense position monsters. And even if your opponent has high attack position monsters, if those monsters have low defense, we can just change them to defense with Meteor Charge and then pierce over them instead, which means having monsters that have 0 defense, especially as boss monsters, can be very, very detrimental right now. And now we're going to talk about an older deck. This is Psychic. So Can Melody, as it came out, a lot of people were saying that it wasn't going to be very, very good. But as we saw as they released, Psychics proved to be extraordinarily powerful. By using Can Melody's effect, we could spin monsters. We could also use it to hit back row. We could also use it in combination with Jump Check to look at our opponent's back row and pop one of them. If we had a combination of the two, we could almost guarantee get rid of all the important back row from our opponent, as well as the fact that we have something like Jump Up, which using our skill Ready Shine, we can just get easy access to this, or we can get easy access to the Prima Gitana, who can just boost our entire board. So very, very easily, we're able to just dismantle our opponent's board. We can gain a ton of attack between Jampy Up and between Prima Gitana. We have Plussing, which includes Searching, which is really, really good. So depending on the cards that we draw for turn, this deck can dismantle any board and boost its attack up to ridiculous numbers and just kill your opponent in one go. Now, notably, Psychics are a little bit volatile. If we don't draw exactly the cards we need, we can't necessarily pull off this big wacky combo. But if we are left alone for a turn, if we're able to amass a large number of cards, pulling this combo off does become fairly easy. And that's why Psychic shouldn't be underestimated and why it can kill your opponent very, very quickly. So next up, we'll talk about Spellcasters. So Seven's Paladin is a reasonably strong boss monster. It starts out with 2900 attack, which is very respectable. It can also gain attack equal to the number of different attributes in both players' graveyards times 400. So in an ideal world, we'll have all 6 in there, and then we'll be gaining 2400 attack, capping out at 5300, which is pretty good. Now 53 is not 6000. We're not realistically going to be able to just smash into our opponent and take them out of the game, but we can get in for a decent chunk. But that's not the only thing this deck can do. We can also summon out multiple Seven's Road Paladin thanks to the effect of the skill, as well as Seven's Road Sorcerer, as thanks to using the skill, as long as we have our Roadstar Swordsman, we can search Seven's Road Magician and add it to our hand, then we can summon out the Seven's Road Sorcerer, use Sorcerer effect, bring back Magician from the graveyard, bring back Witch from the graveyard, Witch effect, summon out the newly searched Seven's Road Magician, then we have Magician, Magician, Witch, and both the Magicians can reach that 3900, and Witch will be a 2000, which is a very, very respectable board. Then if our opponent does have any life points left after that turn, we can slowly chip them down with the Seven's Road Witch, and if they're playing monsters that have particularly low defense, that could be a very, very fast game. And then we'll talk about heroes. Heroes seem a little bit unassuming, and sometimes it feels like they're not quite popping off as hard as these other decks, but I thought I would mention them because they technically can do a little something. So Flame Wingman will burn your opponent for the attack of the monster that it destroys by battle. Thanks to the skill, we can reduce an opponent's monster's attack by 600, meaning Wingman can easily clear 26 and under or crash into 27s. But if we can combine it with a Siesta Torero and a Piercing Samurai, we can change one of our opponent's monsters to face down defense, especially if that's a low defense monster. Let's say they had a 0 defense monster, we can flip down one of their bosses, then use the Piercing Samurai to boost our Flame Wingman. Flame Wingman can then attack over it for 2100, then if it was a 2500 attack, let's say Act Shoot Hydron, it burns them for that additional 25, we've just done 4600 damage, and then we still have 2 attacks coming in with the Piercing Samurai and the Siesta Torero, assuming your opponent doesn't have any more monsters. Now this is a bit more luck-based, this isn't going to happen particularly often, but I did think it was notable to say that this card can do a ton of damage, just not as easily as some of the other ones that we have been talking about. And finally, we'll talk about the elephant in the room, Metarion Assuristar. This card is a really, really cool boss monster. 2800 attack, made of 2 non-tribute monsters, is fantastic. Being able to pop face down cards, also absolutely great. We're loving that. The part of this effect we don't really like is 1 face-up sideboard type monster on your field gains attack equal to the total attack of all face-up warrior type monsters on your opponent's field until the end of this turn. Now already this is a problem when playing against warrior specific decks because we suddenly have this OTK machine that can come out of nowhere, absorb all of their attacks, slam into them, and there's not really much you can do about it. It's a level 9 monster, so there aren't that many ways to actually respond to this card. But if it was only against warrior decks, that would be one thing, but we do have another card, type Change Beam, that does complicate things a little bit. So we can reveal a monster from our hand, choose up to 3 face-up monsters on the field. This turn, those monsters become the same type as the monster revealed to meet this requirement, which means we can turn our entire opponent's board into machines, then absorb all their attack, and then slam into them, and we can basically OTK anything. So why is this a problem? Well, in order to play around this, we'd basically have to just commit to never having 3 face-up monsters, probably not even 2. So we really want to only have 1 face-up monster at any time, in a similar way to how you want to play around Royal Rebel. The issue is not every deck has this luxury, not every deck can just have 1 monster in attack mode. If we think back to when Royal Rebel was really popping off, The only deck that could really do that was Machine, and that's because they had one monster that had Piercing. Now, we do have Ancient Gear Golem now, which means a lot more decks will have access to that Piercer. There are still some decks that can play that. So we've already mentioned Ancient Gear Golem, absolutely fantastic, and people have been playing it in the mirror by using the Fusion Deal skill, which doesn't lock them into using specific monsters, which means they can play that Ancient Gear Golem. So Cyber Dragon can do this if they make Cyber End, otherwise they have to go wide, because if you have a multi-attack deck, the only way you're getting damage in is by attack, 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 and then get that fourth attack direct. So if we're going to go for the twin lines, then yes, we do have to go wide, so we cannot play around this. If we do go for the end line, then yes, that will technically do it, but it's a lot of a heavier investment and can be outed very, very easily, and it's not easy to make a second one if that boss monster does get destroyed. Light Galaxy is another deck that technically can get away with it, but realistically it's not going to work out that well. So Light Galaxy would have to use all 3 copies of their Meteor Charge, which again you can search one of them throughout the course of the game, you can't search the others, so you just have to draw into them. And even then, Meteor Charge is a card that really wants you to be attacking twice, because we can change one face down monster face up, and then we could pierce over another one, so in an ideal world we're attacking 2 times. So if we get lucky and find all those cards early, we also have access to the high level monster, we can use the Secret Order to get it out, and then we can run over 3 500 defense monsters, for example. Technically, yes, we can end the game that way, but again, if our opponent has any trap cards to stop any of that damage, so that'd be a negate attack, that could be Buffered Slime, it especially hurts Light Galaxy because we have to use that Meteor Charge spell, and once it's gone, it's gone. Psychic can potentially just win through any board if they get the right cards, but again, how often does Psychic just draw the God hand? Spellcasters don't really have the opportunity to play this style. Spellcasters can still beat Metarion. I'm not trying to say they have like a horrid matchup into them, although I wouldn't say it's particularly great, but they're very unlikely to be able to just play around having one face-up monster. If you want to get in with the 7's Road Witch to get that piercing, then that's going to be your only face-up monster. It's not too difficult to out a 1600 beta. If we go for our fusion monster, that means we can't get out the Gazelle, because that means a second face-up monster, and our opponent has to have an empty hand to give it piercing. So we're relying on getting that attack over an attack position monster, which again, can work, but it still will leave you open to being hit on the crackback. Elemental Heroes technically can play around this, right? We just summon out the 2100 Flame Wingman, keep attacking with just that every turn and try and burn our opponents slowly. But again, they have the Assura Star, which outs it very, very effortlessly. Again, the Metarion player only actually has to summon out one monster themselves in order to clear your Flame Wingman or any of the single monsters you put out, so you need something that can actually survive as well. The Flame Wingman just does not have the body to do so. Now, Dragon Fusion and the Dragia Star can very easily do this. We're able to just summon out a 3000 attack guy. It can attack twice, it has piercing. On its own, this card can win us the game. Now, is it always going to win us the game? No, but at least it can play around the not having to have 3 face-up monsters to try and win the game. And then Light Machine, again, like we said before, does have a way to do this. We can just summon out a 2400 attack Innovator, keep giving it piercing, and attack, and put a clock on the game where we force our opponent to react to us. So one of the big issues that we've been seeing with the release of fusion monsters is not really having a lot of ways to interact with those fusion monsters when they attack. So the obvious one is Negate Attack. Negate Attack, absolutely fantastic. It doesn't matter what monster your opponent is attacking you with, level 9, level 10, Negate Attack will stop the attack. In fact, the only thing this doesn't work against is Ancient Gear Golem, because it's specifically off. Negate Attack is absolutely crazy. One card that is starting to see a little bit less play is Buffered Slime. And we have started seeing players drop this card from their list, specifically because of Metarion, and I guess a little bit because of some of the other decks as well. Probably Dragon Fusion does come to mind. But the reason people have been dropping the Buffered Slime is just because it is useless against specifically those cards that are going to be ending the game. Assura Star doesn't care about Buffered Slime. Dragia Star does not care about Buffered Slime. So because of that, people have just been cutting this because they're like, well, I need to win the Metarion matchup really badly, and Buffered Slime is just an extra card that could have been something a bit more useful against this specific matchup. So that's already showing that Metarion is warping the meta around itself a little bit. The fact that we're starting to see players drop this card, more specifically, a lot of the Japanese players have been very outspoken that they've been dropping this card from their lists. But Buffered Slime is still a really good card, and it still does work against a lot of the top decks, just not specifically against Metarion. A side effect of this would be that if people are starting to play less Buffered Slime, a lot of the decks that can get beaten by Buffered Slime might see a rise in popularity. Now, notably, off the top of my head, I would say Cyber Dragon can get punished quite heavily by Buffered Slime, because a lot of their boss monsters are level 8 and lower, except again for that Cyber End Dragon. And like Galaxy is a deck that does again spam out level 7 monsters and give them piercing. So Buffered Slime really good into those two decks. So if people are starting to drop Buffered Slime, that might mean that those decks artificially get a bit of a power boost. But basically, we only really have the two really good traps in Negate Attack and Buffered Slime. And since people are cutting Buffered Slime, that means we've already lost 50% of our good trap cards, which feels really, really weird. So a lot of the time it now will come down to, did you draw Negate Attack? No? I guess you die then. But we have started to see some players experiment with Call of the Earthbound. This is a card that did start seeing play back when Noodles were meta, and this was seeing play specifically to deal with Magnum Overlord, which was the OG OTK machine. But using Call of the Earthbound, we can basically redirect an attack that would be a game ender onto a defense position monster so we don't take any damage. Now, Call of the Earthbound is again really, really good into Metarion, but there will be a lot of other decks that this just isn't super great into. For example, Dragiastar F. This will probably still help, you'll probably take a little bit less damage, but realistically that piercing damage is getting to you either way. So Call of the Earthbound, still really good against some decks, not super good against others, and it's kind of a meta call as to whether this is going to be relevant, because there will be a lot of decks that just don't care about it. Now, let's talk a little bit about the OCG. Now, in the physical game, we play with 8,000 life points, that is noticeably 2,000 less than we have in Duel Links. That does mean that any deck that is quite competent at OTKing is going to be a lot stronger in Duel Links, because basically you have to do 2,000 less damage to actually kill your opponent, which might not seem like a lot, but it really does make some of these weaker decks a lot stronger. On top of the fact we have skills, which again do accelerate and make these decks more consistent, which on one hand is really cool, because it means we get to see decks that weren't very strong in the physical game become a lot stronger in Duel Links, and that's something I personally really like to see. On the other hand, it means that sometimes if those cards are a little bit overtuned, they weren't really designed for this format, it can lead to them being meta warpers. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with Metarion, but also some of the other fusion decks as well. Realistically, we don't have a lot of strong outs to these fusion monsters, and some of them are very, very devastatingly strong. The difference between having 8,000 and 6,000 life points could be the difference between dying in 1 turn and dying in 2 turns. And having a turn to answer what your opponent's done can be extraordinarily impactful. Another thing to take note of is that in the OCG, we had access to a lot more trap cards. A lot of the trap cards that are from the physical game that would have been out by now historically are nowhere to be seen. Now, some of them that does make a lot of sense. Some of them probably could have come out a long time ago, but Konami has decided not to give them to us, and I think I know why. But before we get into that, let's go over some of those trap cards that made fusions a little bit, if anything, underwhelming when they first came out. And the first one is going to be the most infamous trap card in all of Rush Duel, Dark Revelation. So, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, shuffle 4 Spellcaster type monsters from your graveyard into the deck, destroy all attack position monsters on your opponent's field. So, it's Mirror Force that you could run 3 of. This card basically warped the meta in the OCG. Everyone was playing basically Spellcaster good stuff. You play a Spellcaster package, you play your 3 Dark Revs, then you play whatever the best boss monsters at the time were, bam, you have a deck. So there's no surprise that Dark Revelation is not currently in Duel Links, but we have to mention it because this is one of the reasons that fusions didn't take off quite as hard as they maybe could have done in the OCG, because we did have a lot of powerful trap cards. And if we had, for example, 3 Dark Revelation in everyone's deck right now, well, Metarion OTK probably wouldn't really be a thing, because why would you invest that many resources into something that's just going to get Dark Revelation anyway? Or at the very least, you would probably be using the second effect of the Ashura Star to pop back row, make sure all your opponent's Dark Revelations aren't going to be there to stop you before you go for the OTK push. Then we have Vengeful Dragon's Counterattack, and this card actually released at the exact same time as Dark Revelation. This was in the original Luke structure deck. So when a dragon type monster on your field is destroyed by an opponent's attack, send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard, destroy 1 monster on your opponent's field. So again, you would still lose a card, so this wouldn't help you with Metarion, but this would be really good into something like Dragiastar that does have that double attack. So they'd get 1 attack in, then you'd say, no, I'm going to destroy your Dragiastar, no more damage for you. So another really good option. Then there's King's Majesty. Now we do have this in Duel Links. We only have 1 copy of it available, and it is limit 3. Obviously in the physical game, we did have 3 copies of this card, which would be another great way to stop those big OTK pushes coming your way. Then there's Beast Gear Secret Art Primal Fist. So when an opponent's monster declares an attack targeting your face-up level 7 to 9 Beast Warrior, Fiend, or Machine type monster, so quite specific, but also you can use it with 3 different types, change the attacking monster to face up defense position. Now the rest of this effect doesn't really matter because the fusions aren't going to be any of these types, but just changing it to defense is really, really good. We haven't actually destroyed the card, but we've basically said we can stop ourselves from dying to it, and I think that's the main takeaway. Changing it to defense is also pretty good because we can attack over it, but what we really want is just to not lose the game on the spot, and this is a really good way to stop that from happening. Then there's Shadow Flower Return, and there's no doubt as to why we haven't got these plant trap cards yet. They are pretty strong, and I expect to see them when we do get the plant fusion monsters, hopefully in the next few boxes. But when an opponent's monster declares a direct attack, so that's a bit awkward because a lot of the time in the cards we've been talking about today are only when our monsters get attacked, so a lot of these guys are piercing, for example. But we can shuffle 3 plant-type monsters from your graveyard into the deck to destroy the attacking monster. Then if we destroy the monster by this effect, we can special summon a plant-type monster from our graveyard face up to your field in attack position. Very, very strong card. Again, technically this would work, but it's only on a direct attack. Then there's Shadow Flower Stance. So when an opponent's monster declares an attack targeting your face-up plant-type monster, we can place 2 plant-type monsters from our graveyard to the bottom of your deck in any order, change all attack position monsters on your opponent's field to face-up defense position. So again, changes monsters to defense, really, really good. Then there's Battle Demotion. When an opponent's monster declares an attack on your face-up machine-type monster, we can pay 600 life points to change 1 attack position monster on the opponent's field to face-up defense position. So again, changing battle positions to those big, scary fusion monsters would be really, really nice. Then we get cards like Constructor Ambush. There are a lot of cards like this, which are basically a combat trick that can increase or decrease a monster's attack. And there are quite a few of them that are quite large. We're talking like 1,000 to 2,000. And I think we'd realistically need those big numbers to either survive a turn or to actually kill the fusion monster that's attacking. But I thought we just mentioned this one as kind of a catch-all. But when an opponent's monster declares an attack targeting a face-up worm-type monster on your field, send 1 level 6 or lower worm-type monster from your hand to the graveyard. The attacking monster loses attack equal to the attack of the monster sent to the graveyard to meet the requirement until the end of this turn. So right now, the biggest one we could probably get rid of is going to be an 1800, but reducing your opponent's attack by 1800 is huge. Then we'll talk about Rebel Scream. This is sort of in a group of traps that stop your opponent from actually fusion summoning in the first place. But when your opponent normal summons a monster, we can send 2 Fiend-type monsters from your hand to the graveyard to destroy all face-up level 8 or lower monsters on the field. So basically, your opponent summons 1/2 of their fusion, you go, hold, we don't need to Rebel Scream yet. Your opponent summons out the second half of the fusion, you know they're about to fuse, flip over Rebel Scream and say, nope, I'm not letting you fuse this turn. So another really good deterrent to fusion monsters. But there are a lot more trap cards currently in the game that will stop fusions. These were just the ones that were released before or with fusion monsters, which means these cards were all available to help us deter the fusion threat in the OCG. Now, noticeably as well, a lot of these cards do specifically say, oh, you need a worm monster, you need a machine monster, when your dragon monster is destroyed. So if Type Change Beam is in the equation, a lot of these traps still don't actually work, which is why I personally think Type Change Beam is part of the problem. But a lot of these traps are still really, really strong into a lot of the other fusion monsters that we are seeing in the meta currently. So the question is, what can we do right now to deal with these big fusion monsters? And the answer is, not much. There aren't that many cards that we can actually put in to help us survive against a lot of these OTK / extraordinarily aggressive and very fast game-ending boss monsters. One of the cards we could start to see play is Siesta Hold, because we can use this to flip half of our opponent's material face down. So if your opponent, for example, summons out an imaginary actor, we can flip that down, or if your opponent summons out Swordsman of Roadstar, we can flip that down, or the Dragon, we can just flip down half of the fusion, and then this won't always stop your opponent, but sometimes this will stop them getting out their big fusion monster. Another one we've already spoken about a little bit, but Call of the Earthbound. If we're not playing Limit 3s, or if we can run this can be really, really strong against specifically those big, scary OTK monsters. Now again, it's not going to work on all of them, but it will work on some of them. But again, we have to have room for it, and it's not going to be good against the entire meta, which means against some matchups, it will be a dead card. And then finally, Buffered Slime. Buffered Slime is still really good. Now, people are cutting this because they're specifically scared of Metarion, but this is still really good if you're worried about Cyber Dragons and if you're worried about Light Galaxy, and those decks are very, very popular, so if you're expecting to see these decks a lot, Buffered Slime is still a really good option. So let me ask you, do you think the game has sped up too much? Would you like to see more defensive options? I personally do not like getting OTK'd out of nowhere. I don't think it's engaging. I don't really like it when there's no back and forth, when basically I haven't drawn a gate attack, so the game is over. So I personally would like to see more defensive options. But I would like to hear from you down in the comments. Do you think the meta is too fast? Do you want more defensive options? What defensive options would you like to see? But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.